Yes, Canada has certainly had a Conservative Prime Minister for the better part of the past decade, but does a Conservative in Parliament mean Canada has in fact become a more conservative country? Let's ask. In Calgary, Alberta, Melanie Thomas, political scientist at the University of Calgary. And with us here in studio, Michael Taube, Sun Media columnist, Washington Times contributor, and former speechwriter for Prime Minister Harper. Christopher Cochrane, political scientist at the University of Toronto. Darren Thorne, adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School and an international lawyer. And John Ibbitson, author of Stephen Harper. He's also a writer at large at the Globe and Mail, and it's great to have all five of you on our program today. You two again, and you two, and Melanie for the first time. Great to have some new folks on the program as well. First of all, congratulations to John Ibbitson. It's a great book. Thoroughly enjoyed it, learned a hell of a lot. And I want to start with this. There's a quote from your book. Stephen Harper would become leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, but he would never be a Tory. What are you saying there?
One of the things that formed Stephen Harper when he was very young was the dichotomy within Ontario political culture that his own family felt and expressed and resented. And that the dichotomy was between what used to be called the family compact, what some of us now call the Laurentian elites, the people in the academic and business and cultural pinnacle in the city of Toronto and in other cities in Ontario, who ran the province and in fact ran the country. And then others, sort of the inheritors of the old reform tradition, who lived in the countryside, who were farmers, who resented these elites telling them what to do and not allowing them to, for example, have free trade with the Americans, which is what they wanted. Stephen Harper, when he was a young boy, would go up to his grandparents' farm up in Grey Bruce, and he would hear from his grandparents stories about how they resented all these British toffs who ran the place. They were the real Tories. And whether they actually belonged to the Progressive Conservative Party, as it then was, or the Liberal Party, for him, they were always Tories. And he pretty much devoted the rest of his political life in opposition to them.
So when Stephen Harper looks back at the government of Brian Mulroney, Progressive Conservative Tory government, or the short-lived government of Joe Clark in 1979, Progressive Conservative Tory government, how were those governments different from the kind of government, non-Tory government, that he's running?
Well, they were profoundly different. Of course, he hated the Mulroney government. And one of the lines in the book was, everyone in Ottawa was a Liberal, especially the Conservatives. Because the Progressive Conservative Party inherited the same broad intellectual tradition as the Liberal Party. It had the same priorities, essentially, as the Liberal Party. Its legislative agenda was, for the main, it was interchangeable with the Liberal Party. It did not understand the West any better than did the Liberal Party. And by then, Stephen Harper had gone West and embraced sort of alienated, reform-inspired political culture that said these guys are running the place, but A, they're running into the ground, and B, they won't listen to us. And so he was one of the very early founders of the Reform Party with Preston Manning that was set up basically in opposition to them. And ultimately, when he merged the Canadian Alliance, which he was leading, with the Progressive Conservative Party, he essentially destroyed that tradition within the Conservative Party as it now exists.
Which makes me ask, Sir John A. Macdonald's Conservative Party of 1867, is that Stephen Harper's Conservative Party of 2015?
I would say no. I would say that the Conservative Party that Stephen Harper created with the merger of the Progressive Conservatives is a unique political animal. It is the first genuinely conservative political party the country has ever had.
Having said that, has Stephen Harper governed as a conservative?
In the main, yes. There are some ideological purists out there, I know, who think that he's not sufficiently conservative.
Well, he bought a couple of car companies. That's not a very conservative thing to do.
He did, but he gave them back. He has reduced the size of the government. The fiscal footprint of the federal government is the same today as it was in the days of John Diefenbaker.
Biggest deficits of all time.
In the middle of a financial emergency, but then he got the country back into balance faster, and he lowered taxes, especially the GST, and he completely reshaped, and I think this is where he doesn't get nearly enough credit. There's a lot in the book where I'm critical of him, but one area where I think he deserves a lot of credit is ending the wars between Ottawa and the provinces. We've had, for the first time, I think in your and my lifetime, 10 years of peace between Ottawa and the provinces because he stopped getting in their face, stopped interfering with them.
Does that overstate it? 10 years of peace? I look at Kathleen Wynne and Stephen Harper, I don't see much peace there.
A tiff here, a tiff there, and there was Danny Williams in Newfoundland and Labrador. But you compare that to the decades of will Quebec stay, will Quebec leave, the profound Western alienation that we had in the 1990s, the massive federal provincial conferences, the last one on healthcare, for example, where all we were doing was arguing amongst ourselves as to how the place should best be run. We don't argue about that anymore, and Stephen Harper has a lot can take a fair amount of credit for that.
Okay, John Ibbitson has set the table for the discussion to come. In particular, let's focus on whether or not Stephen Harper, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, has actually governed as a small c Conservative, which of course John thinks he has in the main, and Mr. Harper would tell you so as well. First thing I need to do, Melanie Thomas, in asking you that question as to whether or not Harper has governed as a true Conservative, is to say that when you get to be my age, you occasionally get to be forgetful. And one of the things I forgot, Melanie, is that you've been on this program before. So I didn't want to lump you in with these rookies over here on my right. You have been here before. From time to time, the host takes a mental break. In any event, in your view, has he governed as a true Conservative?
Well, admittedly, I haven't been here for a few years, so I think you can be forgiven for that. For me, I guess this hangs on one's definition of what a true Conservative means, and this would always be bounded by the Canadian context. And so one of the things I would note coming from Alberta, which is a place in Canada that's presented as much more conservative than it actually is in terms of public opinion, one of the things that I found striking about Stephen Harper, even though we've got this peace with the provinces, as John points out, is that Stephen Harper hasn't been above trading on Western alienation while being Prime Minister himself. So we saw this in the 2008 prorogation crisis, where there was this kind of reaction against the Laurentian elite, and I think that's spot on. But the other thing that's come up during this particular election campaign is that at least Stephen Harper's been prepared to ignore Western alienation to speak directly to voters and say Quebec and Ontario by calling the new provincial government here a disaster in the second, or in the official language that Alberta doesn't operate in, so in French, in Quebec. And it's a sort of, I remember watching that and thinking, my reaction was one that was Western, came from a place of Western alienation. And so I think it's correct to say that a lot of the issues have been taken off the table, and that's been a very deliberate strategy and goal, I think, of the Harper government. But I wouldn't use that to say that the issues have gone away. So Western alienation runs strong here, and I'm in Alberta, and I'm certain it runs strong in other places like British Columbia and Saskatchewan as well. And the other thing I would say is that the national question also runs strong in Quebec, and I don't think that that's faded. I think that one of the reasons why we don't see it present so much in the national debates like we used to is due to as many factors from within Quebec as what it does with Stephen Harper. So these issues are not resolved. They're still there. They just happen to be given less salience at this current time, but that doesn't mean that they might not come back again. Understood.
Has Harper governed, Michael, as a true Conservative?
I could almost literally end my comments by saying what John said and go from right there, because I think John has actually covered it very well. And a lot of things are true. It depends on how you define a small c Conservative in modern terms. If you're going to look, as you mentioned, at the historical example of MacDonald, we have nothing in common whatsoever. But you could also make the argument that progressive Conservatives, the old Reform Party, the old Canadian Alliance, and the current Conservative Party of Canada are four completely separate units. They really are in many ways that they handle things. As a small c Conservative, I would make the argument that Harper has sort of done a mix of it. In theory, we obviously believe in lower taxes and smaller government and sort of streamlining things, trade liberalization, stronger foreign policy. Many of those things are certainly tied in quite nicely. But unfortunately, the way he's done certain things, I've been very critical of, in the sense that targeted tax credits are nice. I prefer broad-based tax relief. You know, I like the fact that obviously he's cut back certain things in the public sector, but infrastructure, he's grown 3 times the amount. He's actually spent more than some Liberal prime ministers have, which as a Conservative aggravates me completely. But in the end, ultimately, I think that for Stephen Harper to succeed, he needed to balance both off. To have this Conservative Canada, the 10-year unofficial plan to sort of build a Canada that was different than the Liberal Canada that we basically thought existed, we needed to reestablish certain baselines to have small c conservative values, but also give the people what they want. They wanted to make sure that there was no hidden agenda, that we weren't going to destroy healthcare, that we weren't going to destroy social services at all, and that people would still have the balance that they want. So
and in the main, he's kept that promise, you believe?
In general, he has, for the most part, and that is the reason why he's won 3 elections. Could he have done more under a majority government? I think so. He could have done a lot more. But I think in the end, he's always sort of the tired and true model. If it ain't broke, why fix it? And if it's worked well for the 2 minority governments, why shouldn't you do the same thing for this majority government? And if he's lucky enough to win on October 19th, continue that same model.
Darren, has he been a genuine small c conservative in the way he's governed for the past nearly 10 years?
I would think so. I mean, by and large, being not of the old stock guests, speaking on behalf of the new stock guests who've come in, I would say, yeah, I would largely agree with the points that were made by both of our guests here. I do think the one thing that I would say, and I think they would probably agree, he's picked his battles rather carefully. If you look at it, I think in terms of social conservatism, there really hasn't been much of a footprint in that area. He hasn't been interested in trying to press those sort of policies forward, the way that we see maybe in the United States with, say, the gay marriage file, or that kind of thing. But if you look at the policies, generally speaking, I think it's undeniable that there's more of a conservative footprint there. The crime and punishment agenda is a great example.
Christopher.
I think he's governed as a conservative in 2 respects. A conservative in a new age definition of smaller taxes, less government, but I think also a conservative in a more traditional sense of careful and cautious. You often hear, for example, that New Democrats described as liberals in a hurry. This is a line that's come up recently. The Reform Party you could have described as conservatives in a hurry. And I think what Harper understood full well is that if you do want to change the country, you have to do it gradually. You can't do it all at once. And so his vision of incremental conservatism, maybe not even cuts, but smaller growth in light of a growing economy, was the way to change the shape of the country. And that's what he was able to do in both minority governments. It's what some might debate he got away from in the context of the majority government, maybe pushing a little bit too much and pushing in places he shouldn't have pushed. But I think all in all, he's a conservative in a very genuine sense of the term.
John, I want to pick up on one of Darren's comments and put it to you. I read in your book that Stephen Harper has an aversion to dealing with social conservative issues. No progress on recriminalizing abortion. No progress on returning capital punishment as an option for the courts and for juries. Gay marriage is another one. Absolutely no attempt at all to reverse the decision of the high courts and criminalize gay marriage. You know that some of his base would have wanted him to tackle all 3 of those things, and he hasn't. Why not?
Because he doesn't believe any governing national conservative party could survive if he did. In 1989, he's only 28 years old. He's still doing his MA, but he's already working for Preston Manning, who's trying to put this new Reform Party together. And he writes a 20-page memo to Preston Manning, and he says, "You're doing everything wrong. Everything wrong. You're a populist party. Conservatives can't be populists. They have to be top down. You want to appeal to the hinterlands, to rural areas. They don't elect governments. You have to appeal to urban and suburban voters. You are allowing an anti-immigrant strain to infect the party. You can't do that. Immigrants elect governments in this country." That was back in 1989 that he wrote that.
And he was right on all 3.
And he was right on all of them. And it was, in fact, the blueprint for his own conservative party. Yes, he wants to be a fiscal conservative. Yes, he wants to shrink the size of government. Yes, he wants to be tough on law and order. But in the main, he believes that embracing social conservative causes, first of all, is wrong. That political parties should be about the core mandates of government, which is, national security, economic security, and B is anathema to the coalition that he put together. And so there's the SOP every now and then. The Maternal Health Initiative wouldn't fund abortions, things like that. But in the main, he's kept far away from social conservative issues, and any conservative leader who wants to keep that party going will do the same.
Melanie, how much disappointment do you think there is in the real small c conservative, social conservative base of the Conservative Party of Canada, insofar as Harper really hasn't tackled any of those 3 hot buttons at all?
Well, I think it's telling if we want to say that Canada is a more conservative place on one hand, and then on the other hand say, but if you tackle social conservative issues, it will be politically toxic. I'm not sure that you can actually hold both of those positions together and then say that and expect them to be not to have some kind of dissonance that's there, right? So when we say that we're talking about conservatism, it's really important to talk about what kind. Social conservatism is one that's difficult to bring about in Canada, in part because of the restrictions that are placed on social policy through things like the Constitution. So this would be equality rights provisions in Section 15 in the Canadian Charter. The other thing, though, with that is that public opinion is also important. So in this case, I mean, one might criticize the Supreme Court of Canada for being a bit activist in how it set out its same-sex marriage reference, but one might also point out that public opinion was on their side. And so here you can see the tension between some parts of the base that might be small but certainly would be loud, would be saying we need to go in these particular directions. But on the other hand, you've got large swaths of the Canadian public from coast to coast to coast that aren't conservative on these issues. And this is where coming from Alberta is, I think, important, because we're seen, I think, stereotypically as being the conservative heartland. And yet, in terms of these social conservative issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, or even you phrase them in more socially liberal senses, things like wanting access for childcare, issues like this, it shows that the place is actually rather socially liberal. And so this is where you need to disentangle the idea between fiscal conservatism and the social side. And the social side is just not a political winner.
Well, I hear you saying that, but Michael, there's a significant chunk of the conservative base, I think if I read John Ibbitson's book correctly, among a lot of new Canadians.
Yes.
South Asian, for example, communities in the ring of ridings around Toronto.
Right.
Who are social conservative and who may have wanted to see more progress on these issues, and they didn't get it under Stephen Harper, and yet they still like him. How come?
Well, absolutely. Look, the one thing about Stephen Harper that I don't know if a lot of people necessarily understand is he's more than happy for you to have a difference of opinion on issues, but you have to divide it between the personal and the political. You can have your own personal viewpoint on abortion. I mean, if you want to be pro-life, pro-choice, that's completely up to you. But in political terms, the Tories are always in campaign mode 24/7, which means that they're always thinking ahead about what people want to perceive, what people might vote for, and what would basically be regarded as anathema. So in this case, abortion is an easier thing to actually avoid, even if you have a position one way or the other. And in the end, the social conservatives are going to more naturally continue to gravitate towards you because they don't have anyone else to vote for.
But he even went further than that. And Christopher, let me get you in on this. There were backbench members of this conservative party when they were in government who wanted to speak on abortion. Just private members who wanted to put forward private members' bills. We know how often they get passed into law, almost never. And yet, he wouldn't allow that even. Not problematic?
Well, I think it is problematic in a political context where other parties provide an alternative for these voters. But we don't have that in Canada. And in fact, we have exactly the opposite, which is that the Conservatives have maintained a silence on this position at the official levels, at the elite levels, as much silence as they possibly could. And the Liberals, for example, have brought it up again as an issue, expelling pro-life candidates from the party. The Conservatives in that situation have absolutely nothing to gain by sending out pro-life messages. They'll lose supporters for doing that. They have very little to gain. And in the meanwhile, the Liberals have shed virtually all of their social conservative base, which wasn't a huge chunk of their support in, say, even by 2000. But it was still there nonetheless, and by 2004, the best evidence that I've seen suggests it was gone.
Although, in fairness, we should mention that Stephen Woodworth was allowed to speak. I mean, you did have one private member who brought it up for a short period of time. He was allowed to make his comments. They voted it down pretty quickly, the Tories, but that's their way of appeasing the base. What they're saying is, yes, we recognize that obviously it's an important issue for Canadians, much as it is, as you say, for sort of the European model, the BMEs, the blacks, minorities, ethnic vote, which is a very typical strategy used by the UK Tories and various others. We're going to bring these issues forward. We're going to discuss them, but don't expect us to go much further than that. So you're basically giving them a small sop, and that's about it.
I have to disagree a bit with this. First of all, I think that the whip, Gordon O'Connor, did everything he possibly could to suppress the backbench rebellion and to keep them from speaking on, even in member statements, they weren't allowed to speak if the issue was going to be on abortion. And I think, by the way, a sign of a government that's tired and in trouble is it is starting to ignore its base, right? We're not giving them anything on abortion, but we don't have to give them anything on abortion because where are they going to go anyway? Well, staying home is one of the things that they can do. Yeah. And we may be seeing this now. This government in perpetual campaign mode doesn't seem to have the the ability to mobilize and expand its base. And it may be that they're paying the price among these social conservatives who just don't, just like George Bush, wondered, what did we actually get out of all this?
Well, the frustration, though, more so, John, is the fiscal conservatives more than the social conservatives. Most SoCons that I've spoken to still seem to be willing to go out there because they're worried about what the alternative is going to be. What are the NDP going to do? What are the Liberals going to do? Is it going to be much worse under them? I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a wild card. We don't know at this point. But I think that, yes, you're right in that sense that they certainly tried to ground it as quickly as they possibly could. But I think Harper himself sort of looked at it as that, look, this is your small moment. This is going to be our discussion, and that's that. Much the same way as gay marriage. He has sort of moved the goalpost past that point because they just don't feel it's right now, it's necessary, even worth discussing or even worth having because most Canadians favor it.
Darren.
And also just tactically, it's smart. I mean, why whip up the opposition? There's already, when they first came in, there was a notion that this was a very conservative government in a way that we haven't been conservative before. There was a real concern on the part of some, certainly groups and some citizens, that it would take Canada in a completely different direction, and people were looking at that kind of askance at the beginning. So why would you start to engage in that? Better to sort of remain silent. And then all the voices which are out there saying, well, look how extreme this government is, has that much less evidence to sort of try and present to the public.
While you have the floor, I want to nudge us into some discussion about Stephen Harper's foreign policy and what achievements there may or may not be. You're an international affairs lawyer, so I do want to start with you on this one, Darren. What's the underlying idea that motivates Stephen Harper's foreign policy as you see it practiced around the world?
I think this is one of the cases where, we've talked a little bit, and I think what part of the point that's come out is that their conservatism has been a bit more sort of incremental on the domestic level. I think internationally, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I was working overseas for the first couple of years of the first Harper mandate, and it was interesting to see because there were changes which came in which seemed to be quite dramatic right off the bat. We really did. And I got this question maybe a couple of years in from international contacts, sort of asking what's going on with Canada. You seem to have really changed your position in terms of a lot of what was the sort of bedrock foreign policy of Canada before. So, I think it's moving away from things like the International Criminal Court. We obviously didn't withdraw, but we were a very strong supporter right off the bat. We were instrumental in its creation. When the Harper government came in, we took a step back, I think probably in sort of deference to the Bush administration to some, in some ways. Our environmental policies seemed to change. We opposed things like the human right to water when the UN tried to bring that in. And so it's more, I think it's typified by probably a skepticism of international or multilateralism. And so particularly with respect to the United Nations, we had a much more sort of skeptical view towards that.
Melanie, when you look at the foreign policy record of the Stephen Harper Conservatives, what's on your list?
One of the things I find striking is a memory I have from around 2008 when the local Conservative MP in the rural area where I'm from consistently referred to the mission in Afghanistan as combat. And it was a deliberate attempt to try to reframe how we were talking about what to that point had been discussed as a peacekeeping mission. And so with this, I think what you see is a kind of dual action where around Ottawa and in the government and then also in the international circles that were just mentioned, we see that there was this clear shift. But the second part of that is that I don't think that there's been a comparable shift within the Canadian public. And this comes through with how people have reacted to the refugee crisis, where we still kind of, the idea that Canada would have been the peacekeeping nation, I think we've kind of let that idea go. But there's still a kind of nostalgia that comes through the public about seeing us as the peacekeeping nation, seeing us as the harbor for refugees. And there's this idea and there's this mythology from the past, which I think is carrying forward now, where we're starting to get this kind of realization from people amongst the public that this is maybe not where our foreign policy is anymore.
A decade of Harper conservatism on the foreign stage. Christopher, what does it look like to you?
Well, there's lots of sort of bold conservative initiatives on the international stage. Certainly the voice on the environment. we could criticize previous Liberal governments for talking a big talk on the environment and doing virtually nothing, but the Conservatives have been on the environmental card very skeptical of worldwide efforts to stem climate change, for example. That's one of the things. Another thing, I think the reorientation of foreign aid policy towards trade, development, economic opportunities, also a bold Conservative initiative, a bold Conservative policy on the international stage, and of course the unwavering support for Israel. There are stories, for example, that some of the Conservative initiatives on Israel were not harsh or strong, but defunding the PLO, for example, or threatening to withhold funds, evoking phone calls from Benjamin Netanyahu asking them to settle down a little bit. So they've been very, very strongly supportive of Israel. And these are ideological principles. They're not, in my view, strategic. They're not tactical. It reflects a genuine commitment to Israel on the part of the Conservative Party. So again, a conservative, small c conservative, new age conservative outlook on the international stage.
Fair enough, John. Let me go to you on some of that, though. It seems as if it is beyond dispute that Stephen Harper has been one of the most pro-Israeli prime ministers, never mind in Canadian history, but anywhere in the world at this time. And yet, on a lot of the big issues that the Jewish community in Israel cares about, recognizing a unified city of Israel, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, Harper's position is the exact same as the previous Liberal government's position. He actually hasn't moved the yardsticks at all on any of that. And yet he's seen as this great champion of Israel. Why?
Well, and he's seen by the Israelis as this great champion of Israel. So it's partly a question of tone, but it's more a question of commitment. You know he believes it. He believes it in his bones. Harvey Gelman had a lot to do with it. Harvey Gelman was a pioneer in computing in the 1950s in Canada, and he worked with Joe Harper at Imperial Oil.
That's Stephen's dad.
Is Stephen's dad in establishing one of the first mainframes in Canada. Harvey Gelman's family had had fled Germany in the 1930s, so he survived, but many of his relatives died in the Holocaust. It was Gelman who talked to Joe Harper about how important it was to protect the state of Israel and defend it and preserve it. And Joe Harper was an enormously powerful influence on Steve, probably the most powerful influence of anyone in his entire life. And Joe impressed on the three sons that, that we are going to do everything we can to protect and defend Israel. And unbeknownst to Joe, he changed foreign policy as a result of it when his son came to power and determined to do exactly that.
But beyond tone, what do you think Stephen Harper's actually done for Israel that Israel likes?
Well, for example, sticking up for Israel at times when Israel is under criticism. One of the very first times I ever traveled with Stephen Harper, we were flying to the G8 summit in St. Petersburg in 2006. Israel had invaded Lebanon. All the other world leaders were calling on Israel to pull back. Stephen Harper in the plane said, no, Israel has every right to defend its borders and protect its citizens, and we support them completely in this incursion. And we all thought, rookie PM doesn't know what he's doing. He'll get slapped down as soon as he gets to St. Petersburg. No, we were just watching the first of many times that Stephen Harper stood alone, even against the Americans, in defending the actions of Israel, especially when it was going into areas outside his own borders.
Michael, let me follow up with this. Three countries in particular that Canada likes to have very good relationships with. The United States, our relations are worse. Russia, our relations are worse.
Correct.
China, they started off horrible. He did almost everything he could to alienate the Chinese when he first came in.
Yes.
He's trying to bring it back to a more traditional, better relationship. 0 for 3 on that front, what would you say?
I don't know necessarily 0 for 3. I don't think we can throw darts at things and sort of judge it from there. I think it's a question of how the world has changed and how certain countries have changed. With Russia, for example, I think we can honestly say that Vladimir Putin is a far more different leader, and I'm being as nice as I possibly can, than anyone we've actually dealt with in the last 20 to 30 years or further on policy. Even some of the Soviet leaders were easier to deal with. Putin is an old Soviet leader, so obviously for someone like Stephen Harper, who has, Reagan, Thatcher, and others in his blood, I mean, that's what he thought, that's what he believes in, that's what his ideology is based on, that drives him up a wall. And so it would be natural that he would oppose them the same way, especially during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, to go up to Vladimir Putin and basically say, get out of there. And he really did. And I understand
Well,
why.
do we know that he really did? Or
Well, I mean,
his press aide said he did.
His press aide said he did. Apparently, from what I understand, I'll let them discuss it, the illusion was definitely there. He was very strong about it, much stronger than any other Western leader. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because what he has done in foreign policy, which I've certainly appreciated, and I think other conservatives had, is we've moved Canada into a leadership role. A lot of countries, both Western democracies and others, are actually very encouraged by the fact that Canada, which is really just a middle power at best, has actually taken a leadership role in certain things, trying to sort of move the goalposts on issues like Afghanistan, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and various others, and as well with Israel too. He has taken a much stronger role that Canada has ever had before. And I think, as Melanie sort of alluded to, that's why people are having so much trouble moving past this, and I've talked about with you before, the Lester Pearson peacekeeping thing. They always just connect the two, and that's all we ever think about. He believes that Canada, in this century, can do a lot more. He believes what Wilfrid Laurier said, that in the 21st century, it will be, that will belong to Canada. He really wants to do that. He has emphasized it. He's worked hard at it. And in many ways, I think he's succeeded at it.
Let's find out, we've got about 10 minutes to go here. Let's find out how permanent or not any of these changes that Stephen Harper has made to our country are going to be. And to that end, I refer back to the Harper Bible by Mr. Ibbitson here. Here's a quote. "A more conservative Canada made Stephen Harper, and Stephen Harper made Canada more conservative. He cut taxes by the score, and neither the Liberals nor the NDP plan to raise them again, except here and there by the margins. He reshaped federal-provincial relations, and no future leader will ever try to impose a top-down, Toronto-inspired national vision on the provinces ever again. No one is going to dismantle his law and order agenda. No one is going to dismantle the Tories' landmark immigration reforms. And the leader who vows to withdraw Canada from foreign commitments, lest they increase the risk of reprisals at home, will be labeled a coward and shown the door." John, I know it is your view that, to the extent that because I've read your book.
According to the Harper Bible.
According to the Bible. I know you believe a lot of this stuff is permanent, but permanent is a long time. Does any of this stuff, in fact, last longer than when he's out the door and no longer Prime Minister?
Well, if it were true that the entire Stephen Harper legacy, or even the sort of the guts of the legacy, can be undone quickly, surely you would see it happening now. He is weak. He's at risk of being defeated. Probably 70% of the electorate now is mobilized against him, or something close to it. And yet, where is the undoing in the manifestos of the other party? Who's raising the GST 2 percentage points back to where it was?
But Mulcair wants to raise the corporate tax
by a couple of points.
Justin Trudeau wants to raise income taxes.
And he wants to only at the very highest levels. Again, I think these are changes on the margins. I think in foreign policy, nobody is rushing to embrace the plight of the Palestinians. I can't find in either the Liberal or the NDP platform as a strong repudiation of everything that this government stood for and has achieved in the last 10 years, and the determination to undo it. From trade agreements to foreign policy to criminal justice to the taxation system to federal-provincial relations, it looks to me that they're all promising to tinker at the edges but leave the rest of it intact.
Melanie, do you think Stephen Harper, after 9 years in power, has created a kind of a new normal that now everybody who's into politics has to acknowledge and deal with?
I think to lay that all at Stephen Harper's feet is a bit of an overstatement. I would suggest that the reason why you're seeing a party like the NDP campaigning so strongly on a commitment to balanced budgets is twofold. One is that they're being strategic and they want to make sure that they don't give the other parties fodder. The other is that other political actors deserve due credit here, and I think where I would rest it would be with premiers like Ralph Klein and Mike Harris, where they certainly set the tone that makes talking about deficits politically toxic. So in that case, I think one of the reasons why Stephen Harper was able to do some of the things that he did was because of people who had come before him. But that means that because it starts in the provinces first and then you have the federal expansion, that give it an election cycle or two, and I think that you would actually be able to see that change again. Things that I see that suggest that this is a little bit less permanent or more transient than others might, would also be talk of things like national programs. So you might not see parties talking about planning to increase taxes because, again, that's probably a political non-starter, at least in terms of a campaign. But what we do see are plans for a national pharmacare program, a national childcare program, national infrastructure expansion. So the Liberals and the NDP both are talking about bringing back these national programs. Similarly, you have other political actors who are new. I'm talking big city mayors. And so maybe, again, this is an Alberta-specific thing, but if you've got Mayor Nenshi and Mayor Ibbitson saying we need a new pact where municipalities are cash-strapped and they need to talk to the people who have the ability to raise more funds, i.e. the provincial and the federal governments, where other actors are going to start to speak up again and ask for a reshift, especially when it comes to how we see federalism, because people will want roads built and they'll want to keep their social programs.
Christopher, how permanent do you think the Harper Conservative revolution will be?
Well, I'm not sure that Harper necessarily should be given full credit for the revolution. He maybe implemented it or at the government level, but I do think that the country was very different for a long time than was often projected during the Liberal governments. There was a westward shift in the country, whether the government reflected that or not. And Stephen Harper, I think, really came in partly as a result of that, but also partly to further it along. In terms of whether or not his policies are permanent or whether they'll be undone, I think Stephen Harper learned from a longer-term trend in Canadian politics, which is that you can get things done incrementally that maybe you can't do all of a sudden. You can get things done quietly that maybe you can't do very publicly. And when we look at the campaigns of some of the parties competing against him, for example, the NDP has proposed to raise corporate taxes, though only slightly. So there's the incremental aspect. The Liberals have promised to raise taxes, but only on the very wealthiest so that the middle class can pay less. So certainly there is the element of incrementalism that I think Stephen Harper, I wouldn't say perfected, but benefited from a great deal, especially during his first two minority governments.
Darren, where are you on that?
Yeah, I would say, it's indisputable that the policies have become more conservative. But I guess the one thing that I would think about is I'm not convinced that there's been a change in sort of the Canadian character. That is, people now sort of have internalized the ideas of these. I mean, most of the Canadian public, I don't think, is really fully sort of aware of what many of these changes are. And when they come to light, often, as we've seen in sort of the refugee case lately, they cause a bit of consternation. So if that's the case, and I do think that's the case, I have a hard time seeing that there would be great public outcry if there was an attempt to reverse some of this. There are, of course, as has been pointed out, structural problems with trying to do that, what with the reduction in the GST. We're not able to fund social programs to the point that we would have been able to before. But I doubt that you'd really have a great uprising amongst the public to try and stop this. So the way I describe it, last point, is just to say that I think these policies have had a very wide reach, but I suspect they might have more shallow roots than people might expect.
More shallow roots, meaning the revolution could be overturned?
Well, the revolution will be televised, and it could be very, I think it could be overturned very slowly.
You didn't make that one up. Michael, how about you on this?
Well, look, I think it's sort of twofold. One, I'm hopeful that what John has said is correct, and certainly that's what I would like to see. I would like to see some of these policies remain in place for a long period of time, and I think some will. I think that, for example, the Liberals and NDP talk a very good game on foreign policy and how they're going to change things. They would be unbelievably foolish to do it when you have all these different Western leaders and various business leaders, political leaders, everybody saying that Canada is doing the right thing. Certainly, if they're in power, they can do whatever they want, and that's perfectly fine. But I think that really it would be a bad move on their part to do it. But the second phase is, and I think no one's talked about this yet, I think we have moved past, finally, the natural governing party mentality once and for all. I think people are now, or at least Canadians are now, willing to say, we're not always going to vote for the Liberal Party. There are other alternatives. There are different ways of governing things.
Well, is Harper the new natural governing party?
I don't think he
Harper
is. I don't think yet. I don't think that the Conservative Canada, which I had hoped for and many other people had envisioned, has quite developed yet. But I think that there are aspects now of modern Canadian conservatism in the Canadian mantra, or at least in the Canadian mentality, and I think they will be continuing to develop over time. But the natural governing party, I think that finally, God forbid, is over.
Darren, a follow-up?
Yeah, we've heard that argument a couple of times, that Canada is now a leader on the international stage. Having worked internationally and spending a lot of time out there, I can tell you there's also a different view. I mean, certainly we're much, much less popular among the multinational organizations, the United Nations, for example. We were unable to secure a Security Council seat for the first time in our history a few years ago. And people may say, well, that doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, moving away from the multilateral system, you could argue just as effectively, has really reduced Canada's imprint and footprint internationally.
I got a minute left here, and I want to give it to the author. Do you think the days of a natural governing party are over? Because you know that Stephen Harper's great quest at the beginning of all of this was to make the Conservatives the new default option for Canadians. How's he done?
It will be Shakespearean if Stephen Harper, having spent his entire life trying to destroy the Liberal Party, this party of brokerage, this party of the centre, is defeated by the NDP. He should actually, in his own way, welcome it. Because I think what he wants to create, and I think circumstances have favored the creation of it, is a broadly based governing Conservative Party with a very strong coalition of Western and suburban Ontario voters, and a progressive alternative rooted in the downtowns, rooted in Quebec, and as well present in Atlantic Canada. And the two will trade government back and forth over the course of the century. History suggests to us that when you do have two parties, center-right and center-left, the center-right party tends to govern more often. That would be his ultimate legacy if he could achieve it. Whether he will or not, though, still remains to be seen. But I think he's made considerable progress, and the country has made considerable progress in that direction.
The last word to the author. I'm happy to recommend for anybody's reading pleasure by John Ibbitson, Stephen Harper. That is about 408 pages of really top-drawer information about the man who has been our Prime Minister for the last 9 years. Melanie Thomas, good of you to join us on the line from the University of Calgary. We're happy to have had you on the program again. Thank you, Melanie. And here in our studio, John Ibbitson, author Stephen Harper, writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail, Michael Taube, former speechwriter for Stephen Harper, now with the Sun Media and Washington Times. And on the other side of the table are two rookies, Christopher Cochran from the University of Toronto, Darren Thorne, Osgoode Hall Law School. Thanks so much, everybody, for this conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.